Hi everyone. Okay, the following video is all about assignment number 1 and the chapter on which it's based, which is the chapter on invention from Leith's textbook. I'm going to start by reading through the assignment, and then I'm going to give you a walkthrough with the notes that I've developed, which I'm going to put up in Drive for you uh, about invention. So assignment number 1 is due by Sunday, the 22nd, this Sunday at 5 p.m. After reading and thinking about the topics covered in that chapter on invention, write 400 to 750 words in response to the prompt below. Proof your writing before submitting it. You can submit your response in the text box or upload your response as a Word doc or PDF. Here's the prompt. After reading the chapter on invention in Leith's book, briefly summarize Leith's points about ethos, pathos, and logos. What do each of these terms mean and why are they persuasive? So that's the first part of your response. Then answer the following question. Which modes of appeal do you think work best when engaging with Gen Zs and or millennials? You could pick one or you could pick both generations. Might be best to just pick one, but up to you. Offer as in-depth an explanation as you can. Offer an example of the persuasiveness of the mode of appeal in your response, or I should say the modes of appeal. Okay, and I'll fix that. So assignment number 1 is all about applying what you learn from Leith's chapter to a generational audience, which I realize is a very broad audience with many different audiences within, but nonetheless a generational audience. So how do ethos, pathos, and or logos seem to work especially well with one or both of those particular generations? Let's go through Leith's chapter, and I think what I'll do is I'll bring up my notes and just kind of walk through those. You've got the chapter, but it starts on page 43, where he just offers you a quick one-page description or intro to the 5 parts of rhetoric, and then he gets into the first of those 5 parts, which is the chapter that you are reading for assignment number 1, which starts on page 45. So first of all, what are the 5 parts of rhetoric? They're also known as the 5 canons of rhetoric. These are basically the steps or stages that you would have gone through classically to develop a speech. These were the textbook steps that were offered to you in order to develop a persuasive speech. So they work as follows. First, there's invention, and then there's arrangement, and then there's style, followed by memory, and finally delivery. Briefly, I'll mention that invention, and I'm going to be going through it, so I'll just say something very quickly about each of these right now, starting with invention. Invention is basically where you're finding the available means of persuasion for an audience, but to do that, it's not invention the way we think of the term. It's really an exploration and an analysis of your audience, who they are, where they come from, how they communicate, what they value. You're playing part anthropologist, part psychologist, part linguist, part, you're playing an interdisciplinary, role here as a rhetorician in your analysis or in the inventional process of developing your speech. You need to get to know who your audience is, what they're capable of hearing, what they're capable of handling emotionally, what they're capable of understanding in terms of educational level, in terms of commonplace beliefs, and working within those limits to develop a series of topics or a series of supporting arguments that would be the basis for what you're going to say in order to move them toward a new way of thinking or feeling or acting. That's invention. And then once you have a kind of draft of topics, a draft of supporting arguments that would be a persuasive set of arguments for that audience, then you would move to arrangement. what's the order in which you would offer those topics? One audience may have a lot of knowledge, a good educational base related to the issue at hand, and so the arrangement of your topics could take one order versus an audience that needs to be taught a little bit about the subject at hand before they can act on it. And so you might rearrange the topics to kind of ramp them up to a place of understanding, or they might have a limited emotional range for the issue at hand. They would be quickly gripped with fear or with anger, and so the arrangement of your topics might be developed in order to kind of build them comfortably and safely to a place of response. So arrangement follows invention. And then style. Traditionally, style comes after arrangement. Frankly, style in many ways is really invention too, but more about that when we get to that chapter. For now, I'll say that classically, style is where you would, kind of add the sprinkles to the sundae. You would add different kinds of tropes and different kinds of interesting rhetorical moves linguistically, the special effects, so to speak, to think old school of like clever uses of language as a kind of, old school version of special effects to the topics and to the arrangement of what you've decided you're going to say. And then look, we're talking in the classical tradition about speech. So once you have drafted out your entire speech, you need to memorize it. And this is a complex stage with many, techniques for, mnemonic techniques. How do you remember a 45-minute, a 1 hour, a 2 hour speech? How is that done? That would be the fourth penultimate canon. And then finally, delivery. How do you deliver that speech? What kinds of gestures and posture would be best used with the audience at hand? How should you dress? How should you speak? Slowly, quickly, with force. What kind of accent, if that's something that you can play with, So these 5 canons are the steps that you would have gone through classically to develop a speech and deliver it. Obviously, in an age of print, in an age now of network communication, these canons, some of them have disappeared in importance, some of them wax and wane in importance. But these are traditionally the 5 canons, and the first one is invention, and this chapter and assignment number 1 are all about this first canon. So what does Leith say about it? Starting on page 45, he talks about how invention is the discovery of the best available means of persuasion. So this is discovering all of the best topics and all of the best ways in which to say things to your audience that would be persuasive to them. Leith goes on to talk about how it can be translated as to come upon the kinds of topics that would work. You might do research into your audience, going to local archives or talking to people from the area, or online, looking through forums, social media, to get a sense of how your audience generally relates to each other and to the topics at hand. That's part of the process, the basic part of the process of invention, is just finding the available means of what can be said. On 46, Leith talks about judging the audience, and he talks about Aristotle's breakdown of the differences in age between young and old audiences, and how young audiences will just have a different relationship to life than older ones. Young audiences may be more full of a kind of open optimism toward the future. Thinking of President Obama's, early campaign stuff about hope, I think that was probably appealing more to younger voters than older. And look, I'm playing with stereotypes here. I'm playing off of Leith's stereotypes, Aristotle's stereotypes, so, things are always more complicated. It's not like young people are, always full of hope and optimism, but and it's not like old people are, as Aristotle says, more cynical, a little bit more closed down in terms of their optimism toward a future. But, the point here is, as part of the role of invention, understanding your audience in terms not only of age, but also of gender, of sex and gender, of race, regionality, trauma, uh, linguistic diversity, language, um, immigration status. There's just so many ways to think about who or what makes somebody who and what they are, and being able to analyze your audience on that deeper level, that's invention. From there, on page 47, Leith introduces the three modes of appeal, which are so important and talked about in so many courses when we talk about rhetoric, which is ethos, pathos, or he puts them in the order of ethos, logos, and pathos. So let me just say quickly, like, what is ethos, logos, pathos on a kind of big scale level? Well, I would say 85% of rhetoric theory is how to support an argument. You have a claim. You want something that people are going to think or do, but how do you get them to agree with that thought or that action? And that's your supporting argument. And when we talk about ethos and logos and pathos, we're basically talking about how to develop supporting arguments for a particular audience. Okay, so let's talk about, and in an academic context, for the most part, it's all logos and a little bit of ethos, very little pathos. But outside of the university, I'd say it's a lot of pathos and a lot of ethos. And logos is just mixed in really complex and really fascinating ways with both pathos and ethos. But the more professionalized an audience, the less I think pathos and ethos tend to play as central a role, and logos tends to show up more so. And again, these are all stereotypes, but to the degree that it helps you understand what's being argued here, what's being presented to you, great. But I would say outside of the professional context of academia or scientific society or some other kind of professional organization, in the everyday, what you tend to see, I think, more is that pathos and ethos are really powerful ways of supporting arguments, and logos is infused within the power and the dynamic that ethos and pathos bring within that public context. Okay, so what is ethos? Leith goes through these three. First ethos, then logos, then pathos. Let's start with ethos. Ethos describes the way a speaker establishes, both overtly and more subtly, his bona fides as a speaker and his connection with the audience. The second, logos, is the way he seeks to influence them by reason, much the poor relation in all this, as witnessed the pervasive irrational. Okay, whatever. Yeah, his cynicism is not interesting to me. And the third, pathos, is the way in which he seeks to stir them to anger, pity, fear, or exultation. All right, we'll get into more detail here, but basically, ethos is how you establish your credibility with an audience. Logos is how you develop your argument in relationship to the common sense reasoning that comes out of an audience and its community, or on a more logical, intellectual level, the ways in which rational discourse is presumed to play itself out within a more professional context. And third, pathos, how your audience can engage emotionally, or how they can kind of supply some of the support for your argument via their emotional connection to what you establish for them. Starting on page 48, ethos. In 99 cases out of 100, you will be seeking to persuade your audience that you are one of them, that your interests and their interests are identical in this case, or to be more convincing in all cases. Kenneth Burke, author of the classic 20th century study, A Rhetoric of Motives, emphasized the importance of decorum, meeting the expectations of an audience as an appeal to ethos. You persuade a person only insofar as you can talk their language by speech, gesture, tonality, order, image, attitude, idea, identifying your ways with with them. Yeah, ideally, maybe, or the easiest appeal to ethos is if you're if you seem like one of the people um, from the community to whom you're speaking. Um, but that's not oftentimes the case. You may be younger than your core audience. Your audience may be of a different race. They may have a different set of a different educational background. They may have a different set of experiences related to culture and regionality. They may speak with, come from a different linguistic background and diversity than you. So it's not just about being like the people in your audience. It can also be about letting your audience know that you aren't really one of them potentially, but you can engage with them in an empathetic way, in support, that you can demonstrate credibility, even as an ally or an outsider. So ethos doesn't have to be just this. It can also be a far more complex dynamic where you, the rhetor, aren't necessarily one with the audience, but you know why and how you're different, and yet can create a connection through that difference. Ethos is also known as the hidden persuader because it's not really something you're saying explicitly. It's something you perform. It's a style of being through speech, through gesture, through posture, through attitude, through anecdotes related to experience that you're able to bring in, and related to what I was just saying, a sophistication in understanding who you are in comparison and contrast to the audience. Okay, so all of that. Ethos is incredibly powerful. Bottom of 49 to 52. The focus on the style of speech and writing is a way of engaging with the expectations of the audience, their values, their style of communication, and more. Yeah, all of this is part of ethos. There's an example given about President George W. Bush on 52. Leith talks about his Ivy League background, but his kind of everyman kind of way of speaking. Bush was good at speaking in a very kind of, with a Texas drawl and speaking in an everyday kind of way to his audience, even though he came from an Ivy League and a highly privileged background. And it's interesting to kind of note how that ethos of your kind of everyday Texan played to a lot of his core audience, not just in Texas, but across the South. So Leith is bringing up George W. Bush. I frankly would bring up, there are plenty of other politicians. Biden to some degree does this too. With his working class blue collar background, his connection to Scranton. Trump certainly tried to play into that too, and I think Trump, like Bush, had a very privileged upbringing, and yet spoke like, I think I heard it said at one point, spoke like someone you might be talking to at the bar, So there's an interesting kind of way in which some politicians have developed an ethos that spoke more broadly to an American population outside of professionalized contexts, academia, etc., in order to demonstrate credibility. So that's ethos. And there's an example related to that of Colonel Tim Collins, who gave a brilliant speech, apparently, before the first Iraq War, I think it was. But it turns out the speech really was better for the media and for the quote-unquote elites than it was for the actual soldiers on the ground, versus General Patton, who I think was kind of known for speaking in a very kind of crude and sometimes crass way, which spoke well. I think Leith and others have said to the soldiers on the ground. And meanwhile, it didn't play all that well with the brass, so to speak, and with the elites. So ethos is a really fascinating topic, and again, I mean, it's not just about whether you're one of us. It can also be how well you can empathize with your audience, how well you can demonstrate sympathy and care and understanding, even if you are an ally or an outsider. So that's ethos. Logos, starting on page 56. If ethos is the ground on which your argument stands, logos is what drives it forward. It is the stuff of your argument, the way one point proceeds to another, as if to show that the conclusion to which you're aiming is not only the right one, but so necessary and reasonable as to be more or less the only one. Okay, so let's get into what that means. First of all, he talks about the difference between science and math and rhetoric. So whereas in science and math, for example, developing an argument is based on absolute certainties, Leith is arguing, rhetoric is really a lot looser with its definition of certainty. Frankly, it's not even all that necessarily concerned with what is absolutely and universally true, what is scientifically valid. It's with what is believable with this audience at this moment in time. And so for philosophers like Plato, rhetoric was seen as a problem because it was not ultimately based on the production of knowledge that would stand the test of time. Leith talks about inductive reasoning, and one way of thinking of inductive reasoning is that it's reasoning from the outside in, meaning you notice a pattern in the world, and from that pattern you come up with a conclusion about how things are. So, for example, if my knee aches an hour before it rains, over and over again, I notice that like my knee starts to ache and an hour later it starts to rain. Then when my knee aches, I might say to somebody, "You better get an umbrella." And that would be an example of inductive reasoning. You've basically intuited a pattern from experience and come up with a conclusion related to it. And that is not necessarily scientific knowledge. I mean, that is an anecdotal belief. It's a belief based in anecdote, based in everyday reasoning about your experience. So again, that's kind of the realm of rhetoric. It deals with probabilities, as Leith says on page 57. And on 57, Leith says if the philosopher deals with knowledge, the rhetorician is much more interested in belief. So obviously this is part of why rhetoric gets a bad name, but I think the importance here is to recognize that rhetoric ultimately and always is about a specific audience at a specific time in a particular place. And that audience's beliefs in a particular place at a particular time are going to change. And a rhetorician needs to be able to go with the flow and understand how that audience changes, how their beliefs change, if they want to make a credible argument. Leith talks about syllogisms versus enthymeme, and I'm not going to get into this too much right now. But a syllogism, there are numerous kinds of syllogisms, but there are usually two premises that lead to a conclusion, and the relationship between the premises has to be absolutely true. And oftentimes, a premise is based on other syllogisms that precede it. So we're talking about a daisy chain, of syllogisms connected to syllogisms connected to syllogisms that lead to particular premises. I mean, it's a complex act of philosophy and knowledge production. So one of the classic examples is that all men are mortal. That's a premise. Socrates is a man. That's a premise. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. So the conclusion that Socrates is mortal is an absolute certainty based on those two premises. And either one of those premises would have been based on a whole series of syllogisms that preceded it. Rhetoric doesn't need to draw out its supporting argument from related to an appeal to logos in such a tedious manner, for one reason, because audiences don't have the patience to listen to a daisy chain of syllogisms, So rhetoricians tend to work more with the idea of an enthymeme, which is a truncated or condensed syllogism. So think of memes, think of bumper stickers, think of sayings. These are all enthymemes. They're all condensed bits of reasoning that, if you were to play them out syllogistically, would have premises leading to conclusions. But again, most people in the everyday, they are working with condensed forms of reasoning beliefs that are not fully understood. They're just part of the community's belief system. They're part of your background based on religion, based on sex and gender, on race, regionality, etc. So we all walk around with a whole set of beliefs that are basically enthymemes, and the rhetorician works with your beliefs at that level. So logos is really about common sense reasoning. It's also found in the use of analogy and simile, and Leith talks about the justification for the first Iraq War. And I'll go ahead and give my own, take on that because I'm old enough to remember when all that was happening. It was an interesting thing to see how the first Iraq War was kind of supported. The argument for going into Iraq was in part supported by an analogy to World War II. So there was an axis of evil, which, the Axis and the Allies, I mean, this was literally the rhetoric of World War II. Saddam Hussein was characterized as a kind of, Middle Eastern Hitler. But at the time that the first Iraq War was being promoted in the U.S., you had the History Channel, known at that time as the Hitler Channel, because all it played were documentaries and histories of World War II. And this was and the U.S. has always had a very positive connection to World War II. It's been looked at as kind of the war in which everything was right, everything was true, and so to analogize Iraq with Germany, with Nazi Germany, and to connect just a justification or support a justification for going into Iraq with this hugely deep and emotional but also logical connection, analogical connection to World War II was persuasive. And frankly, it's interesting to see Putin's justification for invading Ukraine connected to that too. I mean, Russia too has, the older Russian population has a deep connection to World War II with very positive under and overtones. And Putin was, making a play to an older Russian, population, a population that still remembers Soviet Russia, by wrapping the justification for the special operation in terms that related to World War II. So analogy, another really, really powerful way of working with appeals to logos. Finally, there's a discussion about general topics and commonplaces, and I'm getting worried that this video is getting super long, but I'm just going to keep plowing through here. It is getting long. I see it's 27, so this is probably going to be a 35-minute, 40-minute video. Apologies, but anyway. On 61 to 65, Leith talks about the general topics and what are known as the commonplaces. So this gets into Aristotelian rhetoric, but it really gets into Aristotle's kind of background as a philosopher. So Aristotle would analyze the way in which arguments were being developed in the courts, in the markets, and he noticed that there were some general kind of structures, some general logics that seemed to apply to a lot of arguments. People tended to argue from parts to wholes or wholes to parts. They tended to argue in terms of similarity and difference. They tended to argue from issues of degree, cause and effect, what's possible versus what's impossible. So on a very generic level, there are topics that seem to be the basis for a lot of how arguments are structured in terms of logos. There are also the more culturally specific logics that are known as the commonplaces, and they will tend to be so deep-rooted in their appeal that they pass for universal truth. So these really are directly connected to your audience's religious beliefs, their experiences and connections to regionality, to sex and gender, to politics. You pick the sociocultural, sexual, economic basis for how people think, political, etc. And that's where a lot of the commonplaces come from. A commonplace is a piece of shared wisdom, a tribal assumption, and the use of commonplaces, you see where logos and ethos intersect. The commonplaces, the everyday beliefs that are a part of your upbringing. They come from family, from the neighborhood, the street. They come from religion. They come from local politics, from your own personal experiences based on just who you are as a person and how you've experienced the world. Like those beliefs that develop and make up who you are and how you project yourself into the world and how you understand and experience the world, those are the commonplaces. And that's part of logos. When a rhetorician develops a supporting argument related to one or more of them, they are appealing to you via logos. Now, where the line gets drawn between a belief and a feeling, that's a good question. They start to blur together to some degree. And so related to that, I'll just say a few things about pathos, and then I think I'm done. And it's kind of unfortunate Leith doesn't do more with pathos here. Maybe I'll get a chance to say more about it when we get to the chapter on style, but let me just end with a few things about pathos here. So on page 65, Leith writes, pathos is the appeal to emotion, and not just sadness or pity, which is what a film critic will tend to mean when describing this or that scene as full of pathos, but excitement and fear and love and patriotism, amusement. Yes, that's true. So pathos is fascinating, and frankly, I think it is probably the most powerful way in which people are swayed, are moved rhetorically these days, if not, beyond just the modern age in the U.S. It just seemed, or the postmodern age, it just seems like pathos is really the most one. To me, it's the most powerful mode of appeal of the three, outside of professionalized, contexts like academia. And what's interesting about pathos is you get to pathos indirectly. And the example I like to give sometimes is like, look, I can make an appeal to logos, and I can, for example, ask you to just imagine a triangle in your head, or I can ask you to add 2 plus 2 and tell me what that equals, and you're probably going to go ahead and do that and not find that to be a very controversial request. But if I ask you to start crying, or I ask you to start being really angry, like, that's a little bit more weird, to ask someone to just kind of all of a sudden start emoting in some way. So you can't get to people directly oftentimes with your appeals to pathos. What you do is you get to it indirectly by, for example, creating a story or describing a context in which a person or a place or a thing with which your audience has an emotional connection or bond is engaged. It could be something like, yeah, I think I'll just leave it at that. I mean, the way you get to pathos, the way you get an audience to basically supply an emotional connection as a way of supporting your argument for you, is by creating an indirect scenario in which their investments in something or person or place become, engaged. I think a lot of politics these days, when it's a strong appeal to pathos, is basically taking something that is an emotionally core investment in that particular community or audience and connecting it with something that can generate fear or anger or excitement. So pathos is fascinating in terms of how it works, the dynamic in which it has to be developed rhetorically. And I think what's especially important here, not just with pathos, but also with logos and ethos, well, not just with pathos, but also with logos, and this will be the last kind of thing I say, I'm wrapping things up here, is that related to the canon of invention, you want to understand the range of emotions that your audience can handle. When you think about stereotypes related to gender, age, Let's just take gender, for example. I mean, you know, if we take the two kind of traditional genders of male and female, um, you know, there are emotional ranges that are stereotyped to those genders. And, you know, to the extent that there may be some truth to it, then, you know, how you are able to engage an audience based on a particular gender in terms of the emotion that you want them to have an investment in is not going to be easy, or, you know, you're going to have to analyze what's possible. Okay, I don't know if I said that as well as I could have, and I'm not going to start this video all over again to kind of say it better. So let me try and say it again a little bit better. Different audiences are going to have different emotional ranges that you can access. Some audiences, for example, are just going to be scared to death of your topic, and others are going to be really excited and ready to go. Understanding your audience's capacities for an emotional investment in a particular issue is invention. It is the canon of invention. Related to that is logos. You know, understanding the kinds of beliefs that your audience is willing to support, that they have. Or if they don't have it, but they're willing to stretch toward it, that's the canon of invention. You have to understand who your audience is, what they're capable of believing, of feeling, what they're capable of believing in terms of your credibility as a speaker, the ethos. That's the hard work for rhetoric. That's a lot of what is done in terms of marketing and advertising, in terms of political campaigning. Sales is just doing all of the hard work of figuring out exactly who your core audiences are and what their capacities for change are in terms of thought and feeling and action. So I'm going to stop there. At least I'm going to stop with the walkthrough of that chapter. Looking again at this prompt here, after reading the chapter, you want to summarize Leith's points about ethos, pathos, and logos. Look, if you're going to write, I would recommend writing around 600 words for this prompt. So, you know, about 2 pages, the equivalent of it. You know, don't write more than a page in response to this first part. Even write a little bit less. I mean, just pick a few of the most important points from this lecture and or from Leith's chapter. Just pick a few basic points, a couple of points about each one of the 3 modes of appeal, ethos, logos, pathos, to answer the first part of this assignment 1 prompt. I think it would be far more interesting both for me and for you to focus on the second part of this prompt. Which modes of appeal do you think work best when engaging with Gen Zs and or millennials? You know, think about social media, think about TV shows, think about you know, any and all places that might be you know, the focus of one or both of those generations to the degree that they might overlap. I think you're probably best picking just one generation here, frankly. And ask yourself, how best are they engaged with in you know, in terms of ethos, logos, and pathos, and then offer as in-depth an explanation as you can. And I think I'd start with just an example and then use the example to dig into an in-depth explanation. So if you have any questions beyond what I've said about assignment number 1, let me know. Otherwise, all the best getting that done and the forum post by Friday at 5. I look forward to your first forum post. And yeah, have a great rest of the week.